Welcome back to the archive. I'm Paul, and today I want to start with a question. When did you last see the world without glass? Think about it for a moment. Your glasses, your phone screen, your windows, your car windshield, the lenses in your camera, the screen you're watching this on right now. Glass is so close to your eyes that you've stopped seeing it. It became invisible precisely because it became everything. Now, I could tell you the history of glass, and it is a remarkable history. Mesopotamia, 3500 BC, the first glass beads, made by accident in a furnace where sand met heat. Ancient Egypt, 1500 BC, the first glass vessels, blue and green, precious as gold. Rome, 1st century AD, glass blowing invented in Syria, and suddenly glass is everywhere. Cups, windows, mirrors. Venice, 1200s, the finest glass in the world, a city that built its empire on a handful of sand. That is a beautiful history. But that is not the record I want to open today, because the history of glass is not the interesting part. What is interesting is what happened when glass met the human eye, specifically one human eye that was going blind. Here is the thing that stops me every time I sit with this record. Glass existed for 3,000 years. 3,000 years of craftsmen shaping it, merchants selling it, kings displaying it, and in all that time, not one person thought to hold it up to their eye. Not one. 3,000 years. That is the record I want to open today. If you're new to this archive, welcome to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Subscribe before we go further. What we find here, you won't find summarized anywhere else. Let's open the record.
Every record in this archive tells two stories. The story of what happened, and the story of what was already there when it happened. To understand what glass did to the human mind, you have to understand what was already slowly destroying it. Europe, 1250. There was a man I keep returning to in this archive. His name was Brother Lorenzo. Not a saint, not a genius. A scholar, a teacher, a man who spent his life in the world of ideas. He taught at the University of Bologna, one of the oldest universities in Europe. He read, he wrote, he argued, he copied texts and annotated them. He debated philosophy with students who traveled from across the continent to sit in his lecture hall. Knowledge was his entire life. And then, slowly, quietly, his eyes began to fail. It started in his mid-40s. The letters on the page began to blur at the edges. He held the manuscript closer. Then, closer still. He began writing in larger script. Then he began asking students to read aloud to him. By 50, reading was agony. By 55, he had largely stopped. He still taught, he still thought, but the books, the records, the archive of everything he had built his life on were becoming inaccessible. This was not unusual. This was the normal fate of every scholar in Europe. Every monk, every physician, every lawyer, every person whose work depended on reading small text by candlelight. They all knew that somewhere between 45 and 55, their useful years were ending. Not because they were dying, because their eyes were failing. The knowledge in their heads, the connections only they could make, the experience only decades could build, would simply stop being productive. And there was nothing to be done. Physicians prescribed rest, herbs, cold water on the eyes, prayer. None of it worked. For 3,000 years, glass sat on shelves and in windows and in cups, and no one thought to look through it.
This is the part of the archive where the record becomes almost frustratingly simple, because the invention that changed everything was not complicated. It was not the result of years of research. It was not funded by a king or a university. It was, almost certainly an accident. Northern Italy, sometime between 1268 and 1289. The exact date, unknown. The exact location, disputed. Pisa or Venice. The inventor, unknown. We don't know who first held a piece of curved glass up to a failing eye and realized what they were seeing. One of the most important moments in the history of human civilization, and the archive doesn't even have a name. What we have is a record. A Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon described in 1268 the possibility of using lenses to help the elderly see, and by 1289, a manuscript from Florence mentions spectacles recently invented for the benefit of poor old men whose sight has grown weak. Poor old men. That is how it starts. Not with a visionary, not with a philosopher, with poor old men who could not read. The physics is simple. A convex lens, curved glass thicker at the center, bends light in a way that compensates for the aging eye. The eye that can no longer focus close up suddenly can again. It is not magic, it is geometry. But for the person who puts on spectacles for the first time, it feels like a miracle. Brother Lorenzo was in his late 50s when spectacles reached Bologna. I found a record, not of him specifically, but of a scholar of his generation who described the moment of first putting on spectacles. He wrote that he wept. Not from happiness exactly, from the shock of recognition. The letters on the page were sharp again, clear, exactly as they had been 20 years before. He had forgotten what clear looked like. He had simply assumed that this was what growing old meant, that the world slowly became softer, vaguer, less distinct. And then, through two small pieces of curved glass, it wasn't. Now, the spectacles existed. And this is where most records celebrate the invention and move on. But the archive doesn't let you move on that fast, because spectacles were not just a new thing. They were also the end of an old thing. Brother Lorenzo put on his spectacles and returned to work. But he was one of the lucky ones. He was still alive when they arrived. His colleague, a physician who had spent 40 years building an unparalleled understanding of Arabic medical texts, had lost his sight at 52 and died at 61 without ever reading clearly again. 9 years. 9 years of knowledge locked inside a man who couldn't access the texts that would have let him share it properly. And there was another problem. The church was not entirely comfortable with spectacles. Not hostile, not violent, but uneasy. If God had given you weak eyes, there were those who argued that correcting them artificially was interfering with God's design. This argument did not last long. Too many monks wanted to read. Too many bishops were going blind. But it created a brief, strange moment where the most useful invention in the history of scholarship was mildly theologically awkward. And then there were the craftsmen, the men who made their living reading documents aloud to scholars, the scribes who had specialized in writing in large, clear script for failing eyes, the physicians who had built practices around treating bad eyesight with herbs and prayers. All of them, suddenly, unnecessary. Every great invention has its brother Thomas, the man whose skill was built for the world that existed before the machine arrived. The first record I want to show you is not about seeing clearly. It is about time. Specifically, about time that was stolen from human civilization for centuries and then quietly returned by two small pieces of glass. Before spectacles, a scholar's productive life lasted approximately 30 years, from roughly 20 when they completed their education to roughly 50 when their eyesight failed. 30 years. After spectacles, that same scholar could work until 65, until 70, sometimes beyond. 20 additional years per scholar across all of Europe. Now multiply that by the thousands of scholars, monks, physicians, lawyers, and teachers working in Europe in the 14th century. The mathematics are staggering. The combined intellectual output of European civilization increased dramatically, not because more people became scholars, not because universities multiplied, not because books became cheaper, but because the people who already knew things suddenly had more years to do something with that knowledge. Galileo Galilei wore spectacles. He made his most important astronomical observations between the ages of 45 and 77. Without spectacles, those 32 years of work simply would not have happened. The moons of Jupiter, discovered when Galileo was 45, would have waited for someone younger, perhaps another generation, perhaps longer. Roger Bacon, who first described the possibility of lenses in the 13th century, continued writing and theorizing into his 70s. Without spectacles, his most important later work would never have been written. This is what I keep returning to in the archive. We think of great discoveries as the products of great minds, and they are, but great minds need time. They need decades to accumulate the experience and knowledge that makes a great discovery possible. For centuries, that time was being cut short, not by death, by the inability to read a page of text. 2 small pieces of curved glass gave it back. That is the first mechanism.
The second record is about a secret, and about what happens when a secret becomes too valuable to keep and too dangerous to share. Venice, 1291. The Republic of Venice ordered all glassmakers to relocate to the island of Murano. The official reason? Fire prevention. Glass furnaces were dangerous in a city made of wood. The real reason? Control. Murano was an island. Glassmakers could be watched. Their movements could be tracked. Their secrets could be contained. The Venetian glassmakers of Murano produced the finest glass in the world, crystal clear, precisely shaped, colors that no other craftsman in Europe could replicate. And Venice intended to keep it that way. The Council of Ten, Venice's feared secret police, issued a ruling that would stand for over 300 years. Any glassmaker who left Murano without permission would be hunted. If he shared Venetian glass secrets with a foreign power, his family, still on Murano, would be imprisoned. If he did not return when ordered, he would be killed. Agents would be sent wherever he had gone. This was not a metaphor. This was policy. And it worked. For nearly 3 centuries, the secret of fine Venetian glass stayed on Murano. The rest of Europe paid whatever Venice asked, for mirrors, for lenses, for the spectacles that were now changing scholarship across the continent. Venice controlled the glass. Venice controlled the price. Venice controlled who could see clearly and who could not. And then, one night in the 1290s, a master glassmaker, whose name we don't know, slipped away from Murano. He made it to the mainland, then to the Low Countries. Then his knowledge spread. Within a generation, glassmakers in Bohemia, in the Low Countries, in England, were producing glass that rivaled Murano. The price of spectacles collapsed. For the first time, a scholar who could not afford Venetian prices could still access clear vision. The monopoly had broken. Not because of a war, not because of a law, because one man decided that his knowledge was his, not Venice's, and walked away in the dark. This is what the record shows. The second mechanism, knowledge locked behind walls, eventually finds a way out. It always does. Not through revolution, through one person who decides the secret was never theirs to keep. If you've been walking through this archive with me, thank you, genuinely.
choosing to understand the mechanism rather than just the surface story, that's what this archive exists for. If you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, this is the moment. There is much more here, and we are only getting started.
Now the document was signed. The ruling of the Council of Ten had stood for nearly 3 centuries. And I want you to hold that image for a moment, because this is where most records end the story of Murano. The monopoly broke, glass spread across Europe. Move on to the next chapter. But the archive doesn't let you move on that fast, because the monopoly didn't break by itself. Someone broke it. And that someone had a family, still on the island. The man we know only as a master glassmaker, his name is lost, had spent his entire adult life on Murano. He was born there. His father worked the furnaces there. His children played in the narrow streets between the workshops. He knew the secret of Cristallo, the clearest, purest glass in Europe, the glass that made the finest lenses, the glass that Venice was selling to the world at whatever price it chose. He also knew what happened to men who left. He had seen it, a glassmaker who had tried to take his skills to Florence 20 years earlier. The Council of Ten had sent men after him. He was found, he was returned. What happened to him after that, the record does not say. But he was never seen in the workshops again. Our glassmaker knew this story. And yet, something shifted in him. Perhaps it was the price. The price of spectacles in Northern Europe was so high that scholars who needed them could not afford them. He knew what his glass could do for a man with failing eyes. He had seen it himself. A Venetian scholar, old and squinting, put on a pair of lenses and weep. And he knew that the same scholar in Bruges or Amsterdam or London would never have that moment. Not at Venetian prices, not while Venice controlled every lens in Europe. Perhaps it was simply that he was tired of being a prisoner who was called a craftsman. We don't know why. We only know what he did. One night, probably in the mid-1990s, he wrapped his tools in cloth. He said nothing to his wife, not because he didn't love her, because if she knew, she could be tortured for the information. The less she knew, the safer she was. He left before dawn. He took a boat, not the ferry to Venice, but a smaller vessel, east across the lagoon, toward the mainland. He moved quickly. He moved quietly. He did not stop in any city where Venetian merchants might recognize him. The Council of Ten had spies in every major port, in Genoa, in Milan, in Lyon. He went north, through the Alpine passes, into the Low Countries. Bruges, then Antwerp, then, eventually, Amsterdam. It took months. We know he arrived because the glass changed. Within a decade of his disappearance, new glass workshops appeared in the Low Countries producing Cristallo of a quality that had previously been impossible outside Murano. Someone had taught them. Someone who knew the exact proportions of manganese and silica, the exact temperature of the furnace, the exact moment to add the antimony that stripped the green tint from the glass and left it clear. Crystal clear, the kind of clear that could make a lens that could help a man in his 60s read the text that his failing eyes had stolen from him. The Council of Ten sent men north. They found traces, reports of a Venetian-accented craftsman seen in various workshops. But they never found him. Or, if they did, the record doesn't say. What the record does say
is that his family on Murano was arrested. His wife, his eldest son, held as insurance against his return. He did not return. I want to sit with that. Not to judge him, not to celebrate him, but because the archive demands that we look at what it actually cost. Every great liberation has this moment, the moment when someone pays a price that is not theirs alone to pay. He gave the world affordable lenses. He gave Europe the ability to see clearly at a price ordinary people could afford. He gave Galileo the raw material for the telescope that would end 1,000 years of certainty about the cosmos. And he left his wife in a Venetian prison. That is the record. All of it. Not the parts that feel good, and not the parts that feel bad. All of it. Because that is the only way to understand how things actually change.
The third record is the one that I find most unsettling, and the one that connects most directly to the world you live in today. It begins with a simple observation. If one lens helps you see things close up, what happens if you put two lenses together? Hans Lippershey, a spectacle maker in Middelburg, Netherlands, 1608. The story, possibly apocryphal, is that two children playing in his shop held two lenses up in a line and noticed that the weather vane on a distant church appeared much closer. Lippershey built a tube to hold the lenses in alignment. He called it a kijker, a looker. We call it a telescope. Within a year, Galileo had heard about it, built an improved version, and turned it toward the sky. What he saw changed everything. The moon was not a perfect sphere. It had mountains, valleys, craters. Jupiter had moons of its own, 4 of them, moving, orbiting. Venus had phases like the moon, which only made sense if it orbited the sun, not the earth. The sun. For 1,000 years, the Church had taught that the earth was the center of the universe, that the heavens were perfect, that what the eye could see was what existed. Now, any person with a tube and 2 pieces of glass could look up and see that this was wrong. Not theoretically wrong, visibly wrong, obviously wrong. Wrong in a way you could see yourself on a clear night from your own garden. The Church could argue with a book, it could burn a manuscript, it could silence a scholar, it could not unsee the moons of Jupiter. And then, almost simultaneously, another lens maker turned his instrument in the opposite direction. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, Netherlands, 1670s. He ground lenses of extraordinary precision, finer than anyone had managed before, and looked not at the sky, but at a drop of water. What he saw was another universe entirely. Tiny creatures moving, living, invisible to the naked eye, invisible to all of human history up to that moment. He called them animalcules. We call them microorganisms. In 1 decade, glass had broken both limits of human vision simultaneously. Upward beyond the solar system, downward into the invisible world inside a drop of water. And the world that existed between those 2 limits, the world that human beings had always assumed was the complete world, turned out to be a thin slice of something vastly larger. That is the third mechanism. Not just clear vision, the end of the monopoly on what reality is allowed to contain. And I want to sit with something before we close this record. We're doing this again. In 2026, artificial intelligence is giving us a new kind of lens, not for our eyes, for our understanding. The same pattern,
a tool that extends perception beyond its previous limits, the same fear from those who controlled the previous version, the same irreversibility. Galileo didn't know he was ending 1,000 years of cosmological certainty. He was just looking at the sky.
Let me take you to the last room in this section of the archive, the room where all three records are laid out together, side by side, so you can see the whole machine at once. Mesopotamia, 3500 BC. Sand meets heat. Glass is born. 3,000 years pass. Northern Italy, 1286. Someone holds curved glass to a failing eye. The world goes sharp. And three mechanisms activate. First, the stolen years are returned. 20 additional years of productivity per scholar, per physician, per thinker, multiplied across a continent. The intellectual output of Europe quietly doubles, not through more people, but through more time. Galileo works until 77. Roger Bacon writes into old age. The ideas that needed decades to form finally have decades to form. Second, the Murano prison breaks. One glassmaker walks away in the dark. The monopoly collapses. Spectacles become affordable. Knowledge becomes accessible, not just to the wealthy scholar, but to anyone whose eyes were failing. The wall between knowledge and poverty becomes a little lower, one person at a time. Third, two lenses in a tube point at the sky. The moons of Jupiter appear, the mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus. 1,000 years of certainty, visible, wrong. Then the lens turns downward. Creatures no human has ever seen, living, invisible, everywhere. The world is larger than anyone was allowed to imagine. None of this was designed. A craftsman ground a lens. A child played with two of them. A scholar's eye failed at 48. A glassmaker decided his secret was his own. And those small decisions, separated by centuries, became the foundation of modern science, modern medicine, and the modern understanding of what reality actually is. The glass hack, a handful of sand that changed what it means to be human. That is what the archive held today. Not the story of a great inventor building something magnificent, the story of a scholar who could no longer read, of a glassmaker who walked away from an island in the dark, of a man who pointed a tube at the sky and saw mountains on the moon, and of a world that turned out to be so much larger than the one we thought we lived in. If this changed the way you see something, share it with one person. That is how this archive grows. And if you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, the doors are open. Next time, I'll take you to a different shelf entirely. The archive is deep, and what's on the next shelf, you won't expect. The archive has the records, all of them. I'm Paul. I'm the archivist of Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Stay curious and keep reading.